didn't expect it to be so big. Angela Harris stared up at the massive 3-story log mansion in total awe. When she'd been assigned this job, she'd known the people she'd be negotiating with were wealthy, but she hadn't anticipated such a grand-looking home, especially not on a cattle ranch in the middle of Montana. That just goes to show how much of a city snob I am. Angie was a New York girl through and through. She'd been born and raised in the city and had never ventured so far west in her life. The first thing she'd noticed, of course, was how much space there was in Montana. Land stretched for as far as the eye could see, the terrain a fascinating mix of grass plains and sky-high mountains. It was truly breathtaking, and she could admit to herself, a little unnerving. She was used to people and noise and activity. Montana was quiet and still. Her brain didn't really know how to process it, but she could still appreciate the majesty and beauty of the land, even if the calmness of it made her jittery. Angie took a moment to mentally prepare herself for the conversation to come. She ran through all the points she wanted to make in her head and rolled her shoulders to loosen her muscles like a fighter about to enter the ring. Taking a deep breath, she reached out and rang the doorbell. She waited for someone to answer, bouncing on her heels as her blood buzzed with nervous energy. "You've got this. William gave you this job for a reason. You're gonna nail it." Suddenly, the door was yanked open and Angie momentarily forgot how to breathe. A gorgeous giant stood staring down at her through narrowed eyes as green as the pastures surrounding them. Chestnut brown hair framed an angular face with a sharp nose and chiseled jaw. He was tall, towering over her own 5 feet 6 inches and so broad that he nearly took up the entirety of the doorway. "Can I help you?" he asked in a voice like rumbling thunder. Angie took a deep breath through her nose to regain her equilibrium. I'm looking for Harry Blackwood," she stammered, her wits slowly returning to her. The man crossed his arms over his chest, the action making him appear even bigger. "Who's looking for him?" Throwing her shoulders back, she answered, "Angela Harris. I'm a representative of Pathways Development out of New York." The man's face darkened. "I've already told you people know." Angie's eyes widened. "Wait, are you Harry Blackwood?" Unfolding his arms, he gripped the doorframe and leaned down so they were eye to eye. "I am, and I'll tell you the same thing I told everyone else who's come knocking on my door. Blackwood Ranch is not for sale. Now get the fuck off my land." Shoving away from her, he stepped back and slammed the door shut in her face. Angie blinked, shocked by his abrupt dismissal. She'd been told the man might be difficult, but this was a level of hostility she hadn't expected. Pursing her lips, she hit the doorbell again, then pounded her fist against the door. It took a few moments, but it flew open at last, and Mr. Blackwood glared down at her, green eyes flashing with irritation. "Why are you still here? Do you not understand what no means?" "Of course I do, but you can't yell at me like that and expect me to just walk away. I was sent here to talk to you, Mr. Blackwood, and I'm not leaving until you sit down with me." He gnashed his teeth and snarled, "I don't have to do shit. Now you're trespassing not only on my land, but my time. If you don't get out of here, I'll call the sheriff." Angie released a huff of frustration. "Won't you just listen to what I have to say?" "I said get." She clenched her hands into fists at her sides. Clearly she wasn't getting anywhere with the stubborn asshole today, but she hadn't gotten as far as she had at Pathways without being stubborn as hell herself. "Fine, I'll leave. For now. But I'll be back, and you will hear me out." Blackwood sneered. "Don't count on it." For the second time, he slammed the door in her face. She stuck her tongue out, turned on her heel, and stomped away. "I'll be back tomorrow, Mr. Blackwood. I'm going to haunt your ass if I have to." "Hey, Harry. That little hottie from yesterday's back." His mug of coffee froze halfway to his lips. No way. Why the hell would she be back? "She's coming up the porch. Fuck, she looks pissed." Harry's younger brother, Seth, stood at the window next to the door, peeking through the curtains. Harry sat across the living room from him in his favorite chair. Setting his mug down on the nearby end table, he surged to his feet and made his way to stand at his brother's side. Looking through the window's blinds, he spotted Miss Harris bounding up the front steps to the wraparound porch. Irritation made his teeth clench. He thought he'd built up how gorgeous she was in his mind, but she might have been even more beautiful than he'd remembered. Slender and elegant, she had long milk chocolate hair that fell in soft waves to her waist. Her eyes were a golden brown that shimmered when she was angry, and she had the softest-looking lips he'd ever seen. Even as he wanted to toss her off her ass on the porch, he'd been struck by the urge to shove her against the house and kiss the ever-loving hell out of her. She was wearing a knee-length pencil skirt that highlighted her hips and ass, and a green silk blouse. If only she weren't here trying to take my land. Pathways Development had been hounding him and his brothers for months to sell off a chunk of their ranch for some housing development. He'd told them no again and again, over the phone, through email, and even once through a video chat. The last thing he'd heard from them was 2 weeks ago, and had begun to think that maybe they'd finally gotten the message. He hadn't expected them to send someone all the way to Montana to harass him, especially not a temptation like Ms. Harris. Seth let out a low whistle. Damn. Harry drilled his fist into his brother's shoulder, hard. Seth yelped and jumped back from the window, rubbing his arm and gaping at Harry in shock. What'd you do that for? You just keep your grubby little paws to yourself. I'll deal with Miss Harris. Seth stared at him for several moments, then let out a snort. I'll get it. Big Brother's already set his sights on pretty little city girl. Fine, I won't make a move. Last time I pissed you off, I was limping for 2 weeks. Harry scowled. Don't exaggerate. Seth shrugged. Just don't be a son of a bitch, all right? You don't want to scare her away. The doorbell rang at that moment, and Harry shook his head. I have a feeling nothing's going to scare that woman off, he grumbled, moving for the door. He yanked it open, apparently catching her off guard. She stared up at him with wide eyes, and her lips parted with a gasp. Good morning, Mr. Blackwood, she said, a little breathlessly. Fuck, don't talk to me with that voice. Clearing his throat, he furrowed his brow and glared down at her. I told you to get out of here. Her expression hardened and her nostrils flared. And I told you, you wouldn't get away from me that easily. I don't have time for this bullshit. You're not welcome here. Mr. Blackwood, if you would just give me 5 minutes of your time, I don't have 5 minutes to spare. That was actually true. He needed to ride out and check on the cows they'd bred a few weeks back to make sure they'd all taken. He'd be out for hours, and then there was the regular work that still needed to be done. You may not realize this, Miss Harris, but a ranch takes a lot of fucking work to run. My time isn't my own, and I'm sure as hell ain't wasting any of it with you. No, unless we're both naked. She released a huff of frustration. Mr. Blackwood, I'm trying to be civil here. Well, I'm not. He moved to shut the door and end their conversation, but to his surprise, she stuck her high-heeled foot out to stop it. Don't you dare slam that door in my face again. He studied her for a moment, intrigued. The woman was no pushover, he'd give her that. Fine, he nodded, opening the door back up again. Stay here if you insist on it. Doesn't mean I have to. He stepped over the threshold and crowded her to the side so he could move past her. His arm brushed against hers, and it was like an electrical shock ran through him. He heard her take a sharp breath and wondered if she'd felt it too. Doesn't matter. She's not for you. Bending down, he grabbed up his work boots and then sat on the steps to shove his feet into them. Mr. Blackwood, you can't avoid me forever. He glanced back at her as he stood and ran his eyes from her head to her feet and back again. Her cheeks turned a pretty shade of pink, and he couldn't help but smirk. Well, I'd invite you out with me, but you're hardly dressed for the occasion. Her jaw clenched, and he found he rather liked seeing her worked up and frustrated. I can grab her some clothes. Seth suddenly popped his head through the doorway, his mouth tipped up in a wide grin. What the fuck, Seth? Harry growled. She's not going to muck through cow shit. Actually, Ms. Harris interrupted, casting him a chilling look. I think it'd be good for me to see the place. Maybe then I can understand why you insist on turning down a multi-million-dollar deal to keep it all. He stared at her in shock. At length, he murmured, Fine, have it your way. With a flip of her hair, she turned and waltzed into his house after his brother. She shot him one last, haughty look over her shoulder that made him harder than he'd ever been in his life. You ride rather well. Angie turned to look toward Mr. Blackwood, taken aback by the compliment. Thanks, she replied, her cheeks heating. I used to ride horses in the summer at camp. It was one of my favorite things to do as a kid. He grunted and tilted his chin. She thought it might have been his version of a compliment. The two were riding together through a large pasture at least a mile from the main homestead of the ranch. The landscape was incredible, but the silence that stretched between them made her anxious. So, Tell me, whose clothes am I wearing? What did Seth tell you? He said not to tell Keith he'd loan them to me. Who's Keith? Mr. Blackwood was smirking. Another of my brothers. Do the clothes belong to him? He shook his head. Not exactly, but we don't talk about who they do belong to. Oh, I see. She didn't really, but she could guess there was some kind of messy breakup involved. More silence. Mr. Blackwood didn't appear to be the chatty type. She peeked over at him and couldn't help feeling a little bit of awe. He looked larger than life, a big man riding an even bigger animal. He was so at ease in the saddle she wouldn't have been surprised to find out he'd learned to ride at the same time he was learning to walk. There was something so magnetic about him, something so overpowering. Are you enjoying Montana, Miss Harris? Harry asked, snapping her out of her strange musings. Blinking, she gawked at him for several moments as she tried to remember how to use words. Yes, I am, actually. You sound surprised. She shrugged. I suppose I am, a bit. I was born and raised in New York. I've spent my whole life on the East Coast. I've never seen so much space before. He chuckled, and the warm sound washed over her like firelight. Her heart beat a little harder, and she clutched her reins a little tighter. I've been to New York, he said with a nod. Enjoyed myself. It was a relief, though, when I came home. It's difficult going from one extreme you've known your whole life to the total opposite. Hard to feel truly comfortable. She stared at him, startled by his insight. It was as though he were reading her mind. Yeah, that's exactly what I feel. I think this place is amazing, but I feel antsy being here. It's too quiet, isn't it? Yes. New York was too noisy for me, he explained. Well, that doesn't surprise me, though it did disappoint her, oddly. She chalked it up to her loyalty to New York and inability to understand how anyone couldn't love her city. Any other explanation would be crazy. She glanced toward him out of the corner of her eye, checking him out once more as they continued on. God, why does he have to be so gorgeous? It shouldn't make her job more difficult, but it did. Was that why Mr. Blackwood was having this effect on her? Was she just that hard up? She let out a steadying breath and tried to get her thoughts and libido under control. I've got a job to do. I can't think about him that way. I'm trying to buy his land. It was a sobering thought, bringing everything back into perspective. Mr. Blackwood, I have to ask you something, she said, forcing a professional tone. He released a heavy sigh. I guess the truce is over. Truce? We were doing so well not talking about the reason you're here. She licked her lips, wishing she was here for something else, wishing she could just keep talking and enjoying his company. He was startlingly pleasant when he wasn't furious. Why won't you sell? She asked, forging ahead despite her growing qualms. My company's offered price per acre is more than generous, and the planned housing development would be a benefit to the local community. I don't understand. Let me ask you a question, Miss Harris, he said, cutting her off. Will this planned housing development have a low-income designation? She opened her mouth to answer, then shut it again, thrown off guard by the question. I don't know. According to your office, it won't, he explained. The targeted market is upper middle class to upper class individuals, primarily young professionals, not even families. So no, Miss Harris, the development won't help my community. Not those who could really use it, that is. She gaped at him. She'd known the targeted market, but the low-income designation? Why hadn't William told her? Given her a heads up so she didn't look like an idiot. Besides, Miss Harris, this land has been in my family for 3 generations. Selling it wouldn't be my choice alone. My brothers would have to agree, and I can promise you, none of them would. But you're the majority shareholder of the ranch. Legally, you could make the final decision. He smirked. Not gonna happen, Ms. Harris. It'd really be to your benefit to give this up now. Go back home to New York and forget about me and my ranch. I don't think it'd be possible to forget you. Mr. Blackwood, I have a job to do, and a week before I'm expected back in New York, I'm afraid you're stuck with me until then. He met her gaze, but instead of the frustration and irritation she expected, his eyes sparked with intrigue. If that's how it has to be, I suppose I have no choice. His lips tilted at the corners, and for a second, she thought her heart stopped. True to her word, Ms. Harris returned the next day, and the next, and the next. Harry let her join him when he went out for chores and introduced her to each of his brothers. They were suspicious of her at first, and he couldn't blame them, given her reason for traveling to Montana. One by one, though, she won each of them over with her bubbly personality and charm. Despite his best efforts to resist, he found himself falling for her, too. She was beautiful, sexy, intelligent, kind. While her original intent had been to convince him to give up pieces of his family's land, after the second day, she stopped bringing up the deal altogether. He wasn't sure if she finally understood how futile an effort it was, or if perhaps she was falling under the spell of the Montana countryside. He liked watching her eyes light up when she took in the land or interacted with the ranch's animals. She had a gentle touch and a calming presence, bringing even the most stubborn of his horses to heel with a few soft words. Harry wanted her to touch him. With every moment he spent with her, his hunger for her grew. But so did his frustration. He knew if they slept together, it would only ever be one time. She was going back to New York at the end of the week. Even if they tried something long distance, he couldn't expect her to give up her life in the city she loved to be a rancher's wife. Montana was beautiful and new and exciting to her now, but the quiet would eventually drive her crazy, and she'd miss the faster pace of New York. While he was tempted to let himself have her once and send her on her way, a part of him knew if he had her, he'd never be able to let her go. It was becoming a torment, being around her day after day but maintaining his distance. By Thursday, he was both relieved and dreading the fact that she was supposed to leave the next day. When she rang the doorbell, he greeted her with a smile, his heart thumping wildly at the sight of her. She was adorable in her blue flannel, jeans, and boots. "I've got some fence to fix in the north pasture," he told her as he stepped out onto the porch next to her and shut the door. "It'll be just you and me." "Oh?" Had her eyes lit up with excitement, or was that only his lust-addled imagination playing tricks on him? "None of your brothers are coming with?" He shook his head. "Not today." The corners of her lips tilted up ever so slightly. "All right then, let's get going." He led her to the barn to get 2 horses ready for them to ride out. He didn't look at Ms. Harris, afraid he'd lose control of himself if he watched her bounce in her saddle. When they reached the area of the fence that needed repairing, he dismounted without a word, grabbing his thick work gloves and the heavy wire he'd brought along with them. He kept his gaze turned from her and moved to begin his work. The silence between them was heavy as he used his wire cutters to clip away the old twists of metal. He could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't look up. "I shouldn't have brought her out here. I shouldn't be alone with her." The sound of her footsteps approaching made him tense. "Mr. Blackwood, is something wrong?" He kept his eye on his cutters. "Why would you think that?" "You're not looking at me at all." There was a note of hurt in her tone that made his stomach twist. Hesitantly, he turned his gaze up to hers. She stood right in front of him, her soft mouth twisted into a frown. With a deep sigh, he stood from his crouch. She tilted her head to maintain eye contact with him. "Look, Miss Harris, believe me when I say it's nothing personal." As if I'd buy that bullshit for one moment. She pursed her lips and looked annoyed all of a sudden. Her eyes widened as he stared down at her. "Excuse me?" She released a huff of breath, her hands balling into fists. "I thought we were past this." "Past what?" "Past the reason I originally came here," she murmured, her cheeks reddening. "I thought... Damn it, never mind." Turning, she began storming toward her horse. "Hold on a minute," he snapped, going after her. He grabbed her hand to stop her. "What did you think?" "What did you think?" She shot him a glare over her shoulder. "It doesn't matter. This whole thing was ridiculous. I should have gone home when my boss offered to change my flight." He froze at her words and refused to let go of her when she tried to tug herself free. "Miss Harris, you're not going anywhere until you explain what you meant just now." Her struggling ceased, and she took a deep breath. Slowly, she turned to face him. She met his gaze and held it for several moments before responding. After I explained that there'd be no persuading you into selling, my boss said he wasn't surprised, but we had to give it a shot anyway. Then he offered to pay for me to come home early." "Well, how early?" She licked her lips and confessed in a whisper. 3 days ago. 2 days after her arrival. She could have left Montana right away and gotten back to her life in New York, but she hadn't. Why didn't you go? He asked softly. She began, her voice soft, squeezed his fingers. I wasn't ready to leave. Why? He took a step closer to her until their bodies almost touched. Her lips parted as she held his gaze, and her answer came out as a breath. Because I couldn't stand the thought of not seeing you again. Just like that, his control shattered. He groaned, pressing his lips to hers in a hard kiss as he reached up to cup her face. She tilted her head back to meet his bright gaze. Now what? She whispered. His big chest rose and fell with his breaths. What do you want, Angie? I want to give this a try, she confessed. I know that might be crazy and a long shot, but I want to try too, he said, his voice gruff. I'm not ready to say goodbye to you yet. Her heart soared. She flung her arms around his neck, hugging him tight against her. He held her as though desperate to keep her. 1,000 miles and a world of differences stood between them and their happily ever after. But that didn't bother Angie. Their story was just beginning, and she couldn't wait to see where it led them. He was fast losing what little patience he had left. His foot tapped on the cold tile floor as he anxiously searched the crowd for any sign of Angie. Her plane had landed 10 minutes ago. What the fuck was taking so long? Harry! He followed the exuberant cry, and there she was. They ran to each other, meeting halfway, and she threw herself into his arms with a laugh. Holding her tight, he buried his nose in her hair. Video chat couldn't hold a candle to the real thing. When they pulled apart, he gazed down into her eyes. Are you sure about this? She nodded. Definitely. It's been over 6 months, Harry, and I can't keep living away from you. You love New York so much. She cupped his face. I love you more. Besides, William was more than eager to open a new branch of the firm. Even if you weren't out here, I wouldn't pass up such a sweet promotion. He grinned and shook his head, pressing his forehead to hers. I love you, sweetheart. Her smile stole his breath, and he couldn't believe he'd get to see it every day from now on. I love you too, Mr. Blackwood.
I hope you enjoyed watching Falling for the Billionaire Rancher. For more epic stories, please subscribe and turn on post notification. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.